Hello. This week we're not only going back in time, but looking at time itself. It's something most of us take for granted these days, particularly when you remember that the clock as we know it has only existed for a few hundred years. Now, they say time is money, and when it comes to antique clocks, that's certainly true. The National Trust must have a fortune ticking away in all their houses throughout the country. But believe it or not, their advisor on clocks manages to get around their properties on his holidays, because his main job is looking after the clocks at the Old Royal Observatory in Greenwich. Well, we caught up with Jonathan Betts there to find out what an horologist does on his day off.
At the National Maritime Museum, I'm officially titled Horology Conservator, and primarily my job is to maintain and conserve the large collection of clocks we have. We have over 650, I think it was at the last count, and over 50 of those are working all the time. So quite a large part of my work is, of course, just simply maintaining them and keeping them in working condition. How are you getting on then?
I'm just polishing one of the going train pivots.
Right. So you finished the striking train, have you?
Yes, I have.
Unlike more traditional horologists, I firmly believe we should be trying to conserve rather than restore clocks, particularly in the museum context. The National Trust got to hear about me and my rather radical views on conservation as opposed to restoration and smartening things up, and said, would I advise them on the care of their clock collections? At the same time, of course, I have to maintain my work at the National Maritime Museum, so all this work has to take place in my spare time and in my holidays, which means that I don't head off for the Mediterranean in summertime as others do. I jump on my motorcycle and disappear off to National Trust properties. I arrived once, it was absolutely pouring with rain, and I had my full gear on and was met by the custodian, who simply didn't believe that I was the National Trust's advisor on clocks, and announced that there was a very wet young man outside in motorcycle gear, and should they let him in? I'm particularly fond of Snowsill Manor because of the tremendous variety of clocks in the collection.
Snowsill Manor is quite unlike any other National Trust house because it's crammed with Charles Wade's collection, which he started making when he was very young. He came here just after the First War and started to fill the house with his collection of craftsmanship. Very often it's machinery or tools for making other objects. A lot of the things he bought were incomplete or needed to be mended, and this is where he worked on them.
The clocks in Snowsill Manor all have a story to tell, and I'm sure this is what Charles Wade had in mind. I think that Wade was appealing to the child in us all, to the ability to be amazed and intrigued. In that respect, Snowsill certainly succeeds. Well, this is a mid-19th century Japanese pillar clock, and as you can see, it doesn't have the conventional dial of clocks we know. The hours of daylight and dark are divided into 6 equal divisions. 6 hours, we could call them. The day starts at dusk, and these are the nighttime hours, and these are the daytime hours. Now, this setting is for summertime, so that you can see the nighttime hours are very close together, and the nighttime is soon over. The daytime hours are quite well spaced apart. You can see that the daytime is considerably longer than the nighttime. The Japanese clocks at Snowsill Manor represent the very end of the production of Japanese clocks of that type. Apart from collectors who specialise in such things, there are very, very few, and I would imagine they would very rarely come up on the open market.
Now, this clock over here is a Japanese
Yes.
clock too, but to our eyes it looks much more like an English clock.
This is a little earlier than the other Japanese pillar clock. This is a Japanese lantern clock. It has the same figures around the outside of the dial, engraved to show the number of numerals struck by the bell. And around the outside, it has the zodiacal animals associated with each hour. As this dial is divided equally, you might well say, well, how is it then that they manage to squash the hours for winter and summer as appropriate? Well, it's achieved in an extremely ingenious way. Whereas the other clock had one timekeeper, this one actually has two timekeepers. When the clock strikes, you will see that it shifts from one timekeeper to the other. The National Trust have given me this rather splendid title of Horological Advisor on the conservation of their watches, clocks, and indeed the turret clocks. So it's quite a challenging piece of work.
And this clock, that is a bit of a wreck, is similar to the last one we've been looking at?
No, this is in fact another pillar clock. It's really rather a nice one. One rarely sees pillar clocks so large. Unfortunately, it's in rather a sorry state. As you can see, most of its casework is missing. I really think something ought to be done with it because it's such a lovely example. This one actually has a large balance wheel on the front, which is very spectacular when working, and I'm sure would be very entertaining in the true spirit of Charles Wade. Well, I first became interested in horology when I was about 10 years old. I did a holiday job as an errand boy in the family firm, which was a wholesale and retail watchmaker and jewellers. And I soon set up a little workshop at home in my bedroom, repairing friends' clocks and watches. On leaving school, I did a 2-year course, then worked for a year in a London firm, restoring antique clocks and antique musical boxes. I then decided that I could set up in business on my own. It got to the stage where I was taking on enormously complicated restorations where only a small part of the clock was actually that by the original maker. I began to wonder really whether this was the right thing to be doing to antique clocks. Now, this is an interesting clock. I know of only one other outside Snows Hill in the country, which is in the British Museum, and there are two here at Snows Hill. The immediate problem is the dial on this one, which, as you can see, is made of paper and is very badly deteriorated. This dial will have to be sent to a paper conservator, but probably can be rescued as it is. Unfortunately, the other clock behind me has had its dial painted with enamel paint, and I'm afraid there's no hope for that dial now. Restorers are not always the ideal people for doing work on National Trust clocks. This certainly looks as though it's had fairly reasonable treatment, fairly careful cleaning. I'm not terribly convinced by this alarm line. I recall on my...
That won't do, really.
On my report, I recommended proper Dutch chain. I don't quite know why that hasn't been fitted.
And
Doesn't
also
actually...
the hands are
Yes.
much too bright.
Yes, I noticed that. I believe in his report he says that he did do a few spot tests on the old gold paint to see whether it could be removed, and found it very difficult to remove, and therefore left it just as it was, which is probably a wise thing to do. I've virtually completed the cataloguing of the clocks. There are over 50 watches and watch movements in the collections, and in fact, they're not immensely valuable. Strange as it may seem, the value of some gold watches is almost entirely that of the gold content. And sadly, even today, many of these are being melted down. Obviously, that won't happen to the watches in this collection. Well, this is an English tavern clock, sometimes incorrectly known as an Act of Parliament clock. Called so because it was believed that the design was introduced when William Pitt the Younger introduced a tax on clocks. And it was felt that there was a need for more public clocks because people couldn't afford to buy clocks for their own homes. Unfortunately, this design is known to have been introduced in the 1720s, and so that theory actually falls to the ground. Indeed, this style was actually beginning to go out of fashion in the 1790s. Still, it's a nice story, and I like this particular clock because the 9 painted on the dial is in fact an 11, which you may have noticed, which makes it an interesting talking point. 150 years ago, of course, clocks were still set around the country to the time as told by the sun, and the anomalies only became obvious when the railway system was introduced. Having set their watch, say, in Plymouth, and having travelled up to London from a considerable number of miles from west to east, it quickly became apparent that their watches were wrong. So the Shepherd Master clock system was established at Greenwich for sending time signals using the railway telegraph to different parts of the country to enable them to have the standard time as Greenwich did. And people were then able to set their clocks throughout the country to Greenwich Mean Time. This signal was also used to release time balls up in London and in various parts of the country. The red time ball climbed up to the top of the mast between 5, 2 and at 1 o'clock, and then precisely at 1 o'clock the ball dropped, indicating the instant of the hour to the ships in the harbour. In 1714, the British government was so concerned over the problem of not being able to find longitude at sea that they offered an enormous prize at the time of £20,000 to anybody who could provide a solution. It was the great John Harrison, a clockmaker from Yorkshire, who actually produced the first timekeeper, which was portable and was proved accurate enough to take to sea and determine one's longitude. This is Harrison's 4th timekeeper. It's generally reckoned to be the most important timekeeper ever constructed. And if there was one watch that I covet most of all, it is this one, H4.
That's probably one of the most valuable clocks in the world, so it's no wonder he winds it so carefully. If Jonathan has stimulated your interest in clocks, then you might find his little book, The National Trust Pocket Guide to Clocks, of some interest. Well, Harrison's clock might be worth several £1,000,000 if it ever came up at an auction, so is there any hope for the rest of us? Let's have a look at the values our experts put on some of your antiques.
Well, how long have you had this clock?
Over 50 years.
Been in your family for that time?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. The first thing you should notice is I think it must have been plated at some time. You can see here where all the plates worn away.
Not sure what it was. We weren't sure if it was silver or
Probably
pewter.
silver or maybe pewter. It's German. It's come from Germany, turn of the century, around about 1900. And it's a very primitive, cheap sort of movement, if you don't mind me saying so. But the interesting thing about it, why it's got a bit more value than normal, is that if we go inside and I can move this little hand on the front, I think we'll find it is a... There we are. Isn't that lovely?
It is unusual.
So it's in fact a clock, but a clock designed to chime as an alarm.
That's right.
And have you used it yourself to wake you up?
No. I don't think it would wake me up. It's not loud.
It's not loud. It's a very nice clock in the sense that without that chime, I don't think we'd talk about much value. But as a chiming alarm clock, German, turn of the century, at auction, it would go anywhere from about 80 to 120 pounds, even in this condition, because the alarm is working in, well, perfect condition.